I think it's called function notation is the section name. So all we're going to do is we're going to look at, sorry about that, we're going to look at things like y equals x squared, where we put in some number and we get out some number, okay? So a useful analogy for a function is to think of it as a machine that takes some input, so in this case x equals 4. So we put it into this machine and it pops out some output, okay? So it says consider the example of squaring a function. So if we put in x equals 4, we just substitute that 4 where x is. So 4 squared is 16, so we get y equals 16. Okay? So we're just putting in some number and we're popping out some answer. Okay? So it says that the value equals x equals 3 is put into the function, then what is the output? So instead of putting x equals 4 in here, we do x equals 3. So it goes in this machine, right? And what is 3 squared?
9.
Right, so then we pop out y equals 9. So our output is y equals 9. Okay. So this isn't just a one-way machine, right? So what if we wanted to go backwards? So it says if the value is equal, y equals 3, comes out of the function, what was the input? So I'm gonna make a box here. So we have y equals 3. We put that into the function of y equals x squared, and we get out some number of x equals something, right? So how can I solve for x here if we're kind of going backwards now? Right, because I need to find out what x is. Good.
You get the square root?
Yeah, so we can square root both sides, right? So then we'll get x equals the square root of y, right? So if we plug in 3 for y, we get x equals the square root of 3. Right? So yeah, so we get x equals the square root of 3, right? So we're just going backwards. Okay. So when we're thinking about this, it's very similar to what we've done before, right? Where we just substitute in a value and we get some value out. So we kind of introduced this notation. Instead of saying y equals something, we have this function notation where you say f of x equals something, okay? So whenever you see something like f of x, so like this right here, f of x, or even down here, you can just think of that as being the letter or the variable y, right? You get some answer when you put in some value for x. So what we can do, instead of saying something like we did up here, where we have, oh, hey, x equals 4, so plug it into this, we can just put the number in where x is in this f of x. So if I wanted to find the f of 2, that's just saying substitute in 2 wherever you see an x. Okay? So if I have f of 2 is equal to -4 multiplied by 2 plus 1. Right? So all we're doing is just substituting in whatever value we see there for the variable x. Okay. So then we just solve that. So we get -4 times 2 is -8 plus 1 is -7. So our f of 2 is a -7. Okay. And we can do the same thing with -2. So if I say f of -2, well, that's equal to -4 multiplied by -2 plus 1. So -4 times -2 is 8. 8 plus 1 is 9. So f of -2 is 9. Okay. All right, questions on this page?
Can you keep that there just a minute, please?
Yep. So basically what we're doing is just shortening it up. So instead of saying, hey, x equals some value, we just substitute in whatever number we want. Oops, whatever number we want for f of x. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. So given these two functions, so g of x equals x minus 1 over x plus 1, and r of b equals the square root of b plus 14, it says find the following values. So if I wanted to find g of 4, well, we look which function has a g in it. Well, it's this first one, right? So when I have g of 4, that's equal to, all I'm doing is substituting in 4 wherever I see an x. So we have 4 minus 1 on the top divided by 4 plus 1 on the bottom. Right? So we're substituting it into that one specifically. So 4 minus 1 on the top is 3. 4 plus 1 on the bottom is 5. So g of 4 is 3/5. Okay, so if I have g of 1/2, which one am I going to substitute that into? The first one or the second one?
This one.
The first one, right? Wherever I see a g, I see a g, so it's going to be in this one. So I have 1/2 minus 1 on the top and 1/2 plus 1 on the bottom. Yep. So on the top, I have 1/2 minus 1, which is a negative 1/2. And on the bottom, 1/2 plus 1 is 3/2. Right? I just changed 1 over to 1, or 1 to 2/2. 2/2 plus 1/2 is 3/2. Okay. So does anybody know how I can simplify this a little bit? So we have a fraction divided by another fraction, right? Well, this kind of gets back to the idea of how we can multiply something by 1 in a special way and still have the same answer. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to multiply this by 2/2. Right? 2 divided by 2 is just 1. So we're not doing anything, or we're doing what we can do, right? We can multiply by 1 and we'll still get the same answer. But we're doing it in a special way by multiplying it by 2/2. So what I'm going to have is I have negative 1/2 multiplied by 2, which is negative 1. Right? And on the bottom, we have 3/2 multiplied by 2, which is just 3. So I have a negative 1/3 for our answer here. Okay. What about r is r of -5? Is that going to be my first or my second equation?
Second.
Second, right? So I have an r. So all I'm going to do is wherever I see a b, I'm going to substitute in -5. So I have the square root of -5 plus 14, right? -5 plus 14 is 9. So we have the square root of 9, which is 3. Yep. Okay. And then finally, I have r of -15. So if I substitute that in, I have it equals to the square root of -15 plus 14. So -15 plus 14 is -1. So this equals the square root of -1, right? So if I look at this, I see I have a negative number for my square root, right? Which I can't have. So what I'm going to say is this one has no solution, right? So I just put a 0 and a slash through it. That means this one has no solution because we can't have the square root of a negative number, right? So this last one has no solution. Okay? Okay.
And I haven't gotten to that on our homework. Is that going to be a homework question?
Personally, I haven't done the homework, so I don't know, but I'm assuming that it's not going to be on there. Usually they'll only deal with positive numbers.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. All right. The next one says we have some function. So we have -16t squared plus 16t plus 80 that gives the height of a projectile t seconds after its launch. So it says find h of 0 and h of 3 and interpret your answers. So if I do h of 0, right, all I'm going to do is plug in 0 wherever I see a t. So if I plug in 0 to t squared, this first term cancels out. If I plug in 0 into t here, the 64t term cancels out. So all I'm left with is just 80. Right, so h of 0 is going to be 80. So what does that mean in the context of this problem? Can anybody think of what that means in the context of this problem? So what's happening at h equals 0? Well, what I can think about is we're launching some projectile, right? So let me draw a projectile being launched, right? So I don't know. It's my best attempt at a cannon. So we have some cannonball being launched, right? And at h of 0, the ball hasn't moved yet, right? So it's just sitting in this cannon. So at h equals 0, what that means is this is at times 0, so basically nothing's happened yet.
Oh.
So the cannonball or the projectile hasn't launched yet. Right, so nothing's happened to it. Okay, but then it's going to take some path, I don't know, maybe something like that. And we want to find out what happens at h equals 3, right? So I'm going to have h of 3. And what I can do is substitute in 3 wherever I see a t. So I'm going to have negative 16, 3 squared, plus 64 times 3, and then plus 80. Okay, and then we can just simplify that down, right? So we'll have negative 16 times 9. So we have negative 144 here, plus 64 times 3, which is 192, and then plus 80. Okay, so negative 144 plus 192, and then plus 80. We get 128. So h of 3 is 128. Okay. So we want to interpret this. I guess the best way is we start at 0, right? We launch it up, and then after 3 seconds, it reaches this right here. And I just know this because this is in the answer key. But h of 3, this is the maximum height that this cannonball will reach, right? So it's right there. So that's h of 3. Okay. And if you go into quantitative reasoning, or if you decide to get really ambitious and go into calculus, you'll talk about this more on how to find that where that levels out there at the top. But this is just the projectile is at its max height. So the projectile is just at its maximum height at h equals 3. Okay. Okay. Questions on this page so far? This one's going to kind of lead on to the next page, so I'm going to rewrite it on the next page. Okay. All right, so we'll go on to the next page then. So it says find the input values that make this function 0. So I'm going to rewrite it on the next page. So x squared plus 6x minus 1. So I have x squared plus 6x plus 1. And what I'm saying is I want to know when this is 0. And the way I can do that is just by setting it equal to 0. So my f of x, which is this, is equal to 0. Okay? And whenever we have a quadratic like this, so we have an x squared plus 6x plus 1. So we have a quadratic because we have our biggest degree is 2. We can use this equation right here. In this equation is the quadratic formula. And what it does is it helps us find these roots so we don't have to guess. Okay? So all this is saying is these numbers over here, this b, a, and c, or the variables rather, are just the coefficients of each of the things up here, right? So in this case, my a is 1. Since I have this x squared, my a is 1. My b in this case is 6. And it should be minus 1, right? Or is it plus 1? I want to make sure I wrote it down right. It is minus 1. Okay. So my c here is negative 1. Okay. And then all I need to do is substitute in those 3 values into this formula, and we'll get our answers for x. Okay. So we'll get our roots. So I'm going to say x is equal to, I'm going to put a big division bar, negative b, so b in this case is 6, so I have negative 6. Then I have this plus or minus symbol, so I'm going to add and subtract. Okay, and I'll show you how we do that in just a second. Okay, and then we have the square root of b squared, so b is 6 again, minus 4 times a in this case is 1. I'm going to substitute in 1. and then c is -1, so I'll substitute in -1. Okay. And then everything's divided by 2a, and a is still 1, right? So we have 2 multiplied by 1. So all we're doing is just substituting in the values that were given up here. Okay. So after I do that, then we can start simplifying, right? So I'm going to simplify the top as much as I can first. So -6 is fine. I can't do anything with that. It's still plus or minus. And then I can simplify the square root, right? So I have 6 squared, which is 36, right? And then I'm going to add 4 because we have 2 negative signs, right? So those will cancel. So I'll have 36 plus 4, which is 40. So I have the square root of 40. And 2 times 1 is just 2 on the bottom, right? Okay. So the question is, now what can I do? And I'm going to split this into 2 different things. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm adding here and I'm subtracting. So basically what that means is this splits into 2 different expressions. And what that means is that I'm going to have a -6 plus the square root of 40 over 2. And I'm also going to have -6 minus the square root of 40 over 2. Okay. So when I have this plus or minus, it's just shorthand for writing both of these at the same time. Okay. And I think that is fine as far as simplifying it. So I'm going to leave it just like that. We could substitute the square root of 40, and we could plug that into our calculator, right, and get some answer. But we would have to round. So I'm going to leave it just like this. So I have x equals this. Oops. So I'll erase that side. So I have x equals this and x equals this. So those are our 2 solutions. So when we plug those 2 into x up here, we're going to get those equals 0. So this left side is going to be 0 and the right side is going to be 0. Okay.
Would you do that same thing, like if we wanted x to equal 8 or something like that? Would you follow those same steps?
So this only works when you're equal to 0. So what
Okay.
you could do is if this right side is equal to 8, you could just subtract 8 on both sides, right? Because then you would have
Okay.
0 on the right and numbers on the left. Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Okay, so it says, the next one says, use the function machine to find when f of -6 and when f of x equals -6. So the first thing I'm going to do is plug in x equals -6, right? So that's this first one. So if I plug that in, we get -2 multiplied by -6, which is a positive 12, right? 12 plus 7 is 19. So f of -2 should be equal to 19. Right? So we're just plugging in a -6 where that x is. Okay. But then we kind of go backwards. So when we say when f of x is equal to -6, we want to know what x is equal to. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set f of x, which is -2x plus 7, and I'm going to set that equal to -6. Right? So how can I solve for x here?
Subtract 7
Yeah, we can subtract
and
7.
isolate and get the -2x on its own.
Yep, absolutely. So we can just subtract 7 on both sides. So we have -2x equals -13. And then we can just divide both sides by -2. So we get x equals 13 over 2. Yep. So when we have f of x equals something, we solve for x. When we're told what f of x is equal to, or rather when we're given f of -6 in this case, then we just plug it in and solve the equation, right? So we're either solving for x or we're solving for f of x, just depending on what we're given. Okay. All right, so the last question here, this is very similar to what we've done before, right? It says that we're given something in height and we're firing it out t seconds after it's launched. So it says find out when h of t equals 0 and interpret your answer. So all we're doing is saying if this is equal to 0 So I have negative 16t squared plus 64t plus 80 is equal to 0, right? So what we can do is we have a quadratic again, right? So we can use this formula up here again, and we can get when this is equal to 0. Okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to find out what a, b, and c equals to. So a in this case is negative 16, b is 64, and c is 80. Right? And then what I can do is substitute those three into that quadratic. So instead of saying x is equal to something, my variable this time is t. So I have t is equal to, I'm going to put a really big division bar, negative b, so 64, so negative 64, plus or minus the square root of 64 squared, minus 4 times a, which is negative 16, times c, which is 80, right? And then it's all divided by 2a. So 2 and a is negative 16, right? So all I'm doing is just substituting those three values into the quadratic formula. Okay. And now the question is, what can I do now? So I think the easiest first step is to simplify everything in the square root, right? So I'm going to do 64 squared. And then I'm going to, it looks like I'm going to add, right? Because I have a negative 16 and a negative 4. So I'm going to multiply those together. So negative 4 times negative 16 times 80. We get 5,120. And I'm going to add that to 64 squared. So all I'm doing is just that 64 squared, and I'm adding it to all those other three numbers after I multiply. Right? So then I get 9,216. And what I'm going to do is I guess I'll rewrite this. So we have t equals a negative 64 plus or minus the square root of 9,216 over, and then 2 times negative 16 is a negative 32. Right? And I don't know, but I can check to see if that 9,000 number comes out evenly, and it looks like it does. So if I just take the square root of 9,216, I get 96. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that value. So I'm going to have this equal to, so we have a negative 64 plus or minus 96 over a negative 32. Okay? Okay. And then what can I do next? Does anybody have any ideas? So the only thing that's really left with this is this plus or minus sign, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this up into two different things. So I have negative 64 plus 96 over negative 32. And then another answer that I have is going to be a negative 64 minus 96 over a negative 32. Right? So I'm just splitting up that plus or minus sign. And then I can simplify this, right? So I have a negative 64 plus 96, which should be what, a negative or a positive 32 divided by a negative 32. So we get a negative 1 here. And then negative 64 minus 96 is 160. Divide that by 32, and we get a positive 5. Right? Negative divided by negative is going to be a positive. So what I'm saying is that t is going to be equal to negative 1 and a positive 5. Okay? And my question is how to interpret that. So I'm going to redraw that diagram that I had from last time. So I have some cannon, right? And I'm shooting some projectile. And then let's say this is the ground down here. So my question is, what does this negative 1 and this 5 mean? So I'm saying that my height is going to be equal to 0, right? So this 5 here, this positive number, is basically saying 5 seconds after I shoot this projectile out, it lands and hits the ground. So that's that 5. So my height at 0, or my time in seconds at 5, my height's going to be 0, right? So it hits the ground at 5 seconds. So t equals 5. So it hits the ground. So if we think about that, and think about that in relation to -1, well, it never really hits the ground anywhere else, right? But this -1 is what it's saying, is that if we go backwards in time 1 second, so at t equals -1, it would hit the ground again. So it's just completing this arc, but we can't really go -1 second in time, right? Because we're already raising it kind of up on this cliff, right? So this -1 doesn't really make sense as an answer, but that 5 does.